Good morning again, children. We are filming today, and today our story is about Elisha, who was a prophet of God, and a widow, a young widow woman with two children who had a desperate need. Now, this widow woman, she lived in a small house, and she did not have very much. Her husband had died, and he had left her and her two sons with a large debt that needed to be paid. Now, back in those days, if a family could not pay the debt, the creditors, the people they owed the money to, could actually come into the family and they could take the young children as slaves to come and work for them and to work off the debt. Well, of course, the woman, this young widow, she was devastated. She knew if her husband was still alive, he would most likely have paid the debt because he was a good man, he was a godly man, and he loved the Lord. But he was no longer around, and she was faced with this devastating need that she had. And really, the only thing she had of value in the whole house was one jar of olive oil. Now she decided that her best hope was to go talk to Elisha, the prophet, who lived near her. Now, the widow, she went to the house of Elisha, and she knocked on the door, and Elisha came out to visit with her. And she told Elisha of her great need, and she told him about her husband and that he was a man of God and that he really loved God. But now she was in this desperate need because they were going to take her sons. What could she do? Well, Elisha listened to her story, and then he asked her what she might have in her own home. He was looking probably for something that maybe she could do and provide for herself by selling this or getting rid of that. But she had already gotten rid of everything. All she had left was that thing of oil. Well, now, oil was used in those days as money a lot of the times because oil was very valuable. There was at least 4 uses of oil that is spoken of in the Bible. The first one would be they used oil on their skins. Now, I would imagine olive oil was their basic oil that they would use it, and they would put perfumes of different kinds in them so that but they needed the oil on their skin because the air was so hot. It was the climate was very warm in the area where these people lived. Another use was for food. You know, we use olive oil and we use different kinds of oil all the time in our cooking. Another use was for their lamps. They had to have lamps for light in their houses and stuff back then. They didn't have this wonderful electricity that we have nowadays, so they used it for lamps. And they also would use it for healing ointments. You know, they didn't have the type of medicines that we have now, but they found by putting certain medicinal herbs into the oils and putting it on a wound that a lot of times they could use it for healing. So the oil had value, but she didn't have enough of it to come anywhere close to covering the debt that she now had. Now Elisha, when he found out what the woman had to work with, he told her to go home. So she went home, and he told her to go out into her neighborhood and start asking people for empty jars, empty jugs, empty containers, anything they could find. So she sent her sons out, and they began to go around the neighborhood and ask people for empty containers. And they began to bring them and set them on the table and on the floor, and they didn't get just a few containers. She was excited because he was beginning to offer her. She was sure that Elisha had something up his sleeve, and she obeyed him. She didn't question it. Now, the people that they went and got
these jars from and empty containers, they may have had something to say. They were probably a little confused that they were coming to their houses and getting containers, and they asked them what they were for, possibly, and the boys probably said, I don't know, Mom said to do it, so we got to do it. So they just kept bringing more containers and more containers, and pretty soon the house had all these containers sitting around it. What was God going to do? What did God want to do with all these containers? What do you think God may have been thinking when he directed her to get all these containers? Well, finally, they had gotten all the containers they could find. So the boys came back in, and Elisha was very specific that they should go into their house and close the door. So they went in and they closed the door and waited. Well, Elisha had told her that when she found all the containers and had the door closed, that she should take her container that had oil in it, and she was to begin to fill the other jugs. So the boys helped by bringing a jug and setting it before her, and she would pour the oil into it. Well, guess what? She would fill this container, and there was still oil in her little jar. So she would move that one, and she would fill another container, and they would move that one, and she would fill another, and she just kept, the oil just kept coming out of this little container. She didn't know where it was coming from, but she kept pouring and pouring, and when they finally reached the last container, she says, well, bring me another one. And the boy said, there are no more. Well, as soon as they reached the last one, the oil quit. Well, she was so excited, she ran back to Elisha and told him what had happened. Elisha said, well, go take the oil. Now you can sell all these jugs of oil. You can pay off your debt, and there will still be enough for you to live on after that. Isn't God amazing? His provision, just because she was obedient. Now, if she had only gotten 5 containers, she probably would only have had 5 containers full of oil. She couldn't have filled them and then went out and got more containers because it was like, oh, this is cool. No, she had believed that it was important to get a lot of containers. She got a lot of containers, and God provided all that she expected him to provide for her. He provided her all that her faith allowed for her to be provided for, and even more, because remember, it wasn't just enough to pay the debt, it was enough for them to live on after the debt was paid. I just pray that you would develop that kind of faith, that you would have that kind of faith, that when God says, trust me enough to get as much as you can, trust me enough that I will fill every hope, every desire, every bit of what you need, and then a little more, because he loves you and he desires that your faith would be strong in him. I just pray that this blesses you today. God bless your week, and I will see you again next week.